So welcome everyone to this Virginia LERA event. For those of you who are not as familiar with LERA, the Virginia LERA chapter is part of the national LERA, and we started the Virginia chapter several years ago when Virginia adopted collective bargaining at the local government level. National LERA and Virginia LERA as a part are the only organization that brings together labor, management, neutrals, arbitrators and mediators, and academics all in one organization with a mission of learning from each other. So I'm delighted that we're able to present this program today and delighted that you are all here to join us. Let me just mention we do have a few more programs coming up in the spring, not yet up on our website, but please check back with our website. And now that you've registered for this, you should get emails about future programs. Our next program, which we don't have a final date for, but we're going to have representatives from UPS and the Teamsters to talk about lessons from their most recent negotiations. So that'll be a terrific presentation, and we'll be getting that up as soon as we tie down the dates from these very busy folks. So let me go ahead and introduce our speaker, Jeff Barnes. I heard Jeff speak a couple of months ago and thought this would be a terrific presentation for LERA. I won't spend much time talking about Jeff because you saw his bio, but let me just say he's a lawyer, but not a labor lawyer. He grew up in Southwest Virginia, where he heard lots of stories about the coal mine wars. And as he went to write his first novel, Mingo, he used that background that he learned about the unionization of the coal industry as the background for his historical novel. And he did a lot of research. It's an excellent labor history story. So I'm just going to turn it over to Jeff.
Great. Thank you, Anne. I want to thank the Labor and Employment Relations Association and its Virginia chapter for inviting me to join you here today and to talk about my novel, Mingo. This is my first novel. It was published in 2021 by a wonderful indie publishing house here in Richmond, Little Star. And I want to thank Joni Albrecht and her wonderful team at Little Star for helping me get Mingo into print. I also want to just quickly thank David Robbins, who's a local author, playwright, novelist, and wonderful creative writing instructor, for kind of rekindling my desire to write fiction after I took some short story classes from him about 7 or 8 years ago. And David provided great guidance to me throughout my work on this book. And incidentally, his most recent novel is about to be released on January 17th, and it's called Trans-Mongolian Express. So again, I want to thank David for all he's done for me. What I thought I'd do today is talk a little bit about how I came to the story, touch briefly on a couple of the book's themes, and along the way talk about some of what I've learned about the Mine Wars history, but I'm always careful to issue a word of caution that I'm not an historian. I've done a lot of research into the topic, but I've always found in giving these talks, there's invariably somebody or more than one person who knew more about the Mine Wars than I do. I hope I have gotten my history correct. One of the things I learned in writing historical fiction is there's a real temptation to try to cram every fact that you've learned into the book, and you have to avoid doing that. In the process, though, sometimes there are people or events that you may know about that aren't in the book, and that's one reason why. The other thing I've learned about historical fiction is at the end of the day, it is a work of fiction. And so at times it may be necessary to bend the facts in service of the story. And one example of that in Mingo is the use of scatter tags. Scatter tags were a way that coal companies could identify their coal to the end user. So they would toss or scatter these tags into their coal cars when they left their tipples. And if a end user liked the way a coal burned, if it burned cleanly or it was hotter than other coal, they then could identify where that coal came from so that they could ask their coal broker the next time, hey, I want a load of coal from Red Jacket, for example. But as you see from this slide, from the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum, it was a display there. Scatter tags weren't widely used until the 1930s. Well, in my book, it appears in 1908 because I needed something for the younger brother in my story who ends up being sent away from West Virginia to Richmond, and once he gets there, he goes to the railroad yard in search of a scatter tag. He's looking for a scatter tag that belonged to the mine where his father and brother had continued to work in West Virginia. So again, there were occasions where I bent the facts in service of the story, for example. To sort of set the stage here, and those of you who haven't read Mingo, Mingo refers to Mingo County. Mingo County is there in the red band. It is one of three of the most southwest counties in West Virginia that were the last to organize, last to unionize. By the 1910s, 20s, every other coal county in West Virginia had organized. And in fact, in most of the eastern coalfields, they had organized. But Mingo and then Logan County, which is just to the north and east, and McDowell County, which is just to the south and east of Mingo County, they were the last three to organize. And there was this bloody struggle, if you will, to organize those counties. And the book tells this story of fictional brothers, Durwood and Bascom Matney, who get separated in 1908 upon the death of their mother. And the younger brother, Durwood, who was 8 years old at the time, gets sent to Richmond to live with his ma's favorite cousin, Grace, and her husband, Walker, who was a well-heeled, well-to-do railroad attorney living in Richmond. And while Bascom, who was 13 or 14 at the time, remains behind, toiling in the mines beside their father, who's descending into alcoholism. Durwood grows up in affluence on Monument Avenue under the influence of intensely capitalist Walker, while Bascom feels that life is passing him by in the mines, or the pit, as they called it. And when they reunite 12 years later, it's on the day of the Matewan Massacre, or the Battle of Matewan, as it's variously called, which was May of 1920. And when they reunite, they find themselves on opposite sides of this second coal mine war and hurtling towards the final confrontation at the Battle of Blair Mountain. And the book explores their divergent paths and examines how time and physical distance and ideological differences can drive a wedge between even the closest people. So back to how I came to the story. I grew up in Tazewell. Tazewell is there highlighted in yellow on the slide. Tazewell is 19 miles southwest of Bluefield, West Virginia. My father grew up in Pocahontas, West Virginia. Pocahontas is right on the Virginia-West Virginia border. And coal was first mined in Pocahontas in 1884, and it was a coal boomtown in the late 1800s. There were over 20 saloons in Pocahontas and even an opera house. And if I remember correctly, stories my father told, his father tended draft mules in the mine at Pocahontas as a young boy. And this would have probably been in the 1890s, I'm assuming. And this slide shows three of the boys draft mule tenders. I've always enjoyed this picture because the boy in the middle looks like he's just seen a ghost. And I was intrigued by my father's tales about his childhood in Pocahontas, Virginia, because most of his friends were first-generation Americans of Hungarian and Italian descent whose parents had come to America, much like the Peduzzis in the novel, looking for a better way of life. And he told me that most of his friends' parents didn't speak English, or certainly didn't speak it that well, which was so different than my upbringing a couple of generations later. Another thing that drew me to this story was my childhood fascination with this Battle of Matewan, or the Matewan Massacre, this gun battle that erupted on the main street or Mate Street. It was essentially a main street of Matewan in May of 1920. And it was a gun battle between dozens of coal miners and 11 Baldwin Felts agents. And Baldwin Felts agents were security guards hired by the mines to keep the mines open and the union out. And when the gun smoke cleared, 7 of the 11 Baldwin Felts agents lay dead on the street. 2 coal miners were dead, and the mayor of Matewan, Cabell Testerman, was also dead. And I was fascinated and intrigued by how a gun battle could erupt on what was essentially the main street of a town in broad daylight, involving dozens of gunmen during my father's lifetime, in a town very similar from his and just down the road from where he grew up. Another thing that always interested me and fascinated me were stories about brothers who ended up on opposite sides of the Civil War. You know, if blood is thicker than water, how does that happen? So I decided to marry these two interests in writing this story. And then the final, excuse me, didn't mean to advance the slide. The final thing that led me to the story was John Sayles' 1987 movie Matewan. And so in January, roughly January of 2017, I began researching the Mine Wars history, and particularly this Matewan shootout or massacre. And what I discovered after months of research were the bones of a great, if overlooked, story of the Mine Wars. And I encountered these amazing real life characters, such as Mother Jones. She's pictured here after being arrested for her activities during what is termed the First Coal Mine War. And this was a war in Cabell Creek and Pink Creek in 1912 and 1913. If you look at her there, she looks just kind of like a grandmother would look, harmless, nice. If you thought that, though, it would be at your own peril, because she was quite the Union firebrand. She was frequently in West Virginia. She loved the coal miners. She was a socialist and supported all union activities, but the coal miners were her particular favorites, and she referred to them as her boys. And this is a flyer showing she was speaking in Matewan in June of, I think this would have been 2021, right before the Battle of Blair Mountain. She was dubbed the most famous, a dangerous woman in America, and these next two slides will illustrate why. Presumably, she's there on the steps of this church. This is at a rally in Eskdale, West Virginia. I don't know the year, probably 1912, 1913, but I don't know that. But what's interesting about Eskdale is in the 1912 election, which was the same election that Eugene Debs, who is a perennial socialist president for candidate for president, got 6% of the nationwide vote. And Eskdale elected a straight socialist ticket in that election. And this next slide is my favorite. You see her, she's surrounded by all of these miners and their families. She's in the middle of them, arm raised, no doubt exhorting them to join the union and throw off the oppressive yoke of the coal operators. Another character I encountered was Sid Hatfield. Sid was the police chief of the town of Matewan, and he was the person who organized and led the miners in this gun battle in Matewan in 1920, May of 1920. And for that, he was revered by the coal miners and reviled by the coal operators. He and about 19 others were tried for the murders of these Baldwin Felts agents and was acquitted, and the national press was there, and he was quite the celebrity. They dubbed him Two Gun Sid and Smiling Sid. And this next slide will show you why they dubbed him Smiling Sid, though I'm not sure why he liked to smile. Another character I encountered was Don Chafin. He was the sheriff of Logan County. Logan, again, was one of the three counties that was the last to unionize. And he was known as the czar of Logan County because he was paid very handsomely by the coal companies to keep the unions out. It was said that he made 10 cents a ton per coal dug in Logan County and was a millionaire by the early 1920s. And then Tom Felts, he was the owner of the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency or Security Agency that, again, the coal operators hired to keep the mines open and the union out. In addition to these interesting characters, I discovered some just amazing real life events that Ripley wouldn't believe, like the February 7th, 1913 Bull Moose special attack on the Holly Grove tent camp. These tent camps were formed and funded by the United Mine Workers, and they took in miners and their families who had been kicked out of company housing. In the early 1900s, I've read that about 90% of all West Virginia coal miners lived in company housing, and the companies owned the towns, they owned the houses that the miners lived in, they owned the company stores. And if you joined the union or were suspected of union activity, your belongings were thrown out on the street and you were left on your own. Many of these folks, of course, were immigrants with no family, no places to go. And so the union set up these tent camps, and one was set up at Holly Grove. The Bull Moose Special was a train that the coal companies used to haul strike breakers up into the mountains. As you might imagine, the strikers didn't care much for the strike breakers, and so they would sit up in the mountains and take pot shots at the train as it chugged up the mountain. Well, to protect the people on the train, they armored the train with steel plating on its sides, and they armed it with machine guns on top of the train. And so on February 7th, 1913, 1913, there had been a gun battle earlier that day in Mucklow between Baldwin Felts agents and coal miners, and a couple of Baldwin Felts agents were killed. So that night, Sheriff Bonner of Kanawha County commandeered the Bull Moose Special, and he drove it through this tent camp. And mind you, there were tents on the other side of the tracks too, and they shot up these tents, these homes, if you will, with machine guns. And fortunately, the miners had gotten word. Most of the miners were out, but one person, a man named Sesko Estep, was killed. Another event that I encountered was the August, I think, 1st, 1921 murder of Sid Hatfield. After being acquitted for his role in the Battle of Matewan, Sid Hatfield and his right-hand man, Ed Chambers, were then charged with blowing up a mine tipple in McDowell County. Like Logan, McDowell tended to be more anti-union. And so on the day of his trial, he and his wife, arm in arm, and Ed Chambers and his wife, arm in arm, were walking up the exterior steps to the courthouse lawn when a Baldwin Felts agent named C.L. Lively and two other men appeared at the top of the steps, gun blazing, and they gunned down Sid Hatfield and Ed Chambers. The women were not physically harmed. Obviously, you can imagine their emotional trauma. I'm going to digress just a bit and tell you of an interesting encounter I had in August. I was in West Virginia selling books, and I had a woman come up to me and asked me if I would sign a copy of my book, and I told her I was happy to, and she said something to the effect of, that Mingo is the most historically accurate depiction of the mine wars she'd ever read. And I asked her, well, how is it that you know so much about the mine wars? Why are you so interested in it? And she said, one of my relatives is a character in your book. And I said, excuse me? She said, one of the Baldwin Felts, my father-in-law was one of the Baldwin Felts agents in your book. And I said, which one? And she said, C.L. Lively. C.L. Lively was the man who shot and killed Sid Hatfield. And it was that killing that then kicked off the Battle of Blair Mountain, which was the August-September 1921 battle that's the largest armed insurrection in U.S. history after the Civil War. And like so many other people I've talked to since I've written this book, I was shocked that I'd never heard of this battle between 10,000 miners dubbed rednecks for the red bandanas they tied around their necks, and 3,000 state troopers and mine guards and assorted townspeople that Don Chafin had organized and who were dug in on top of Blair Mountain, trying to prevent the miners from getting over the mountain into Logan County and then into Mingo County. They were going to open up the jails there and liberate their pro-union brethren who were in those jails. The Don Chafin's forces, though smaller in number, had better equipment. They had automatic weapons, they had machine guns, they even employed 3 biplanes that dropped homemade bombs on the advancing coal miners. The miners outnumbered the Don Chafin's forces, but their arms weren't quite as up to date as you can see from this combatant who was on the Union side. And the battle only ended when President Harding sent in federal troops and made everybody put down their guns and go home. And this was a political cartoon of the day. It's Uncle Sam telling the West Virginia miners, you've got till Thursday to go home. And this was one of the gripes that the miners had, was that every time they seemed to be gaining an upper hand, the coal companies called upon Uncle Sam or the Fed or the state law enforcement to side with them. So I realized that after doing this research that there was a great story waiting to be told, and one I think deserved to be told because we're still dealing with all the same issues of race and class and labor relations back then, and thought if I could come up with a couple of compelling characters to weave through this rich theme of historical events and interact with these colorful characters, that there was a story there to be told, and in the process introduce readers to the mine wars. I've heard my good friend David Robbins say, if you want to learn history, read a history text. If you want to understand it, read historical fiction. And to his point, I had a friend of a friend who read Mingo before it was published, and she said something like if she'd encountered the mine wars in a history text, her eyes would have glazed over, but in the context of historical fiction, it was accessible and interesting. And then she went out and did her own research after that. And I think that illustrates the power of historical fiction to introduce readers to a time in history or an event in history that they might not otherwise know about or think they might be interested in, and hopefully present it in a way that makes it accessible. I'm going to switch gears here a little bit and talk about a few of the themes of Mingo. The working title was My Brother's Keeper because the book is replete with instances of characters helping each other. One of the issues that the book deals with is class struggle. You've got, Richmond, Monument Avenue, Richmond folks versus these two boys who grew up in the mountains of West Virginia. And you've got some characters, namely Hattie, who was the Black domestic worker in the home that Durwood went to live in and that Bascom spent some time in, who demonstrates that honor and character and dignity are not things that are dependent upon where we're born or to whom we're born, but there's things that are innate to us. Don't depend on our station in life, if you will, and our affluence and our education. Race was one of the big issues in the book, and sort of how it was handled differently in the mountain culture of West Virginia versus what Appalachian novelist Lee Smith has called the highfalutin culture of Richmond in the Old South. When both boys arrive in Richmond and they meet Hattie, this Black domestic worker, they both refer to her as ma'am. They call her ma'am, and she tells them both, don't do that, please. It's better if you don't do that. And Bascom was 18 years old when he encounters her for the first time, and he pushes back and he says, well, where I come from, manners is manners. And she said, I understand, but it's not done here. I'll know you're thinking it even if you're not saying it. Another event that deals with race in the book surrounds an event at the Robert E. Lee Monument, which was on Monument Avenue, and it's a celebration honoring Robert E. Lee. And Bascom, who's just arrived in Richmond, a little bit confused, and he goes down into the kitchen early that morning to talk with Hattie because they're all going to be going to this event. Hattie's not, but the family is, and he's confused because he wants to know what all the fuss is over somebody who's been dead 20 or 30 years and who was the losing, general in the Civil War. And she said, what you have to understand is that Robert E. Lee is the most revered figure in Richmond. And he asked her, well, how does that make you feel? And she said, very poignantly, I keep my feelings to myself. Again, showing the stratification based on race that existed in the South at the time. And then for many people, the most poignant scene was something that happened while they were at that Robert E. Lee celebration. And Bascom has just caught the eye of a pretty young girl that later becomes his girlfriend. And as they're talking, he sees a Black gentleman struggling under the weight of some boxes, and he rushes over to help him. And so the next day, when Bascom and this girlfriend, soon-to-be girlfriend named Belle, are together, she's curious about why he did that. And so I'm just going to read just a section of the book, starting with Belle. You helped him carry those boxes. Why? Because he looked like he could use a hand. Something wrong with that? He's colored. I may have my shortcomings, Miss Bell, but poor eyesight ain't one of them. Well, in case you haven't noticed, white folks in Richmond don't exactly treat coloreds with kindness, but you did, and I'm trying to figure out why. The man was struggling, and I ain't had no excuse not to lend a hand. When I was in the mines, I worked with colored folks, Italians, and Hungarians too. Know what I come to learn? Belle shook her head. Down in the dark, you can't tell nothing about a man's skin. Only thing mattered was if you could count on him. Does that make sense? Does to me, but you keep it between the two of us. Folks around here haven't been in the mines. And so I don't mean to suggest that there wasn't racism in the coalfields, because certainly there was. There was segregation, the coal camps, the housing tended to be segregated, not only along racial lines, but along nationalities too. I met a man recently who's 75, and he grew up in Kentucky. And even in his youth, which wasn't that long ago, told me they had I think it was in a Hungarian section of town, an Italian section of town, Black section, and he said the WASP section. So there was certainly segregation. There certainly was racism, but it was, I think, less. And part of that reason, I believe, was because the miners were generally paid the same regardless of their nationality, their race, and they were paid based on how much coal they dug. And they also sort of had this common enemy, if you will, and the coal company that, was fighting them to keep the union out. The the other thing that I've learned that I think sort of validates this was, again, during this period of time in the early 1910s, 20s, I believe the only two local union districts that had blacks as members was District 17, which included Mingo County, and District 29, which included Beckley, nearby Beckley. And the most overarching theme in the book was this theme of the struggle between labor and management. As I said earlier, the union was trying to organize these three southernmost counties in West Virginia, and the independent coal operators were bound and determined to employ any means necessary to prevent it from happening, resulting in this life and death struggle and earning Mingo the nickname Bloody Mingo. The owners thought that they would be at a competitive disadvantage if they had to pay union dues and union benefits. It was seen by many people as a political struggle between socialists and capitalists. I think many people saw and believed that the union was a shill for the socialists. And of course, we know that in 1917, the Bolsheviks had taken control of Russia, and certainly by 1920 made no secret of the fact that they intended to export communism throughout the world. And I think this resulted in a genuine fear in some people that this really was what was happening. This was an attempt to undermine our economic and political system, and it was a socialist movement, if you will. And keep in mind, the slide I showed back in 1912 in Eskdale, they elected a straight socialist ticket. For others, I think it was a convenient boogeyman. There was other people on the side of the anti-union side. They saw this as a way to try to curry public favor sentiment on their side of this issue. And so there were lots of political cartoons at the day that sort of play this up, and that the unions were, just a front for the socialists or the communists. But at the end of the day, I think for the rank and file miners, it was a bread and butter issue. As Bascom said, they don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican or a socialist. What they cared about was being paid an honest wage, fair wage for an honest day's work in a relatively safe environment where they were valued more than the draft mules that hauled the coal to the surface. And they saw the union as their best way to achieve those goals. And they were going to support whatever party or politician supported the union, or at least didn't oppose the union. And these next three slides, sort of 3 or 4 slides, deal with kind of what was going on then and help illustrate it. This is a photograph from an exhibit at the Beckley Exhibition Coal Mine in Beckley, West Virginia, which is a great museum, by the way. And it's a 1-ton coal car. And that was what most coal companies paid their miners. You were paid based on your 1-ton coal car, how much you dug, how much you loaded into the car. But frequently what happened and what they complained of was that the coal companies would build up the sides of these coal cars so that they actually held 2 tons. So they're loading 2 tons of coal and only being paid for 1. And of course, payment came in the form of script. This is a picture of an exhibit at the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum of the various kinds of script, and there were many more. Each mine had its own script, its own currency that was redeemable only at that company's store. Mind you, the companies owned the company store, they controlled the prices, and the miners had to buy their goods there because the script was not redeemable anywhere else. And they wanted, of course, to be paid in dollars. So if they wanted to go into Charleston, they could do that and buy things at a dry goods store. And then this last slide, it's from April of 1916, I believe. I'm assuming this is a monthly statement. I don't know that, but I'm assuming it's a monthly statement. And you'll see that $2 was owed to the store for purchases that had been made since the last payment. 25 cents was deducted for the doctor, 25 cents was deducted for the hospital, whether or not those services were needed during the pay period. 15 cents was deducted for the burial fund. This miner was actually paid by the hour, not by the ton. And it looks like he worked 21 hours paid $2 an hour. He was owed $4 or earned $4.44 that month, but after you take out the deductions, his take-home pay was $1.79. So it sort of illustrates the reason why these coal miners were so intent on trying to get the union in there during this time. I'm going to spend the rest of our time considering this idea of two sides of a pancake and what implications, if any, it might have for democracy today. I'm going to issue another warning at this point, just like I'm not an historian, I'm not a social scientist, nor am I a political scientist. And what I'm about to say from this point forward are simply my own musings on the topic. But with that said, many people have been intrigued by this. There's a saying in the book that we're going to talk about two sides of a pancake. Remember, a pancake, no matter how thin it is, always has two sides. And many people have told me it was their favorite line in the book. And to set the stage, in chapter 45, Durwood has returned to Matewan in 1920. It's his first time home since he left in 1908. And he just happens to arrive on the day of the Matewan massacre, or the Battle of Matewan, and he witnesses this carnage. And after the gun smoke clears, he finds himself on the wrong end of Sid Hatfield's gun. And Sid Hatfield has identified him as having been with the Baldwin Felts agents before the gun battle started. And he's going to arrest him, pistol whip him, shoot him, something, but it's not going to be good for Durwood. And fortunately for Durwood, he's rescued by a woman who had been on the train that had pulled up to the station just as a gun smoke was clearing. And she pretended that Durwood was her husband in order to get him away from the clutches of Sid Hatfield. And the two of them, her name was Irma, and the two of them meet later that night for dinner. And Durwood is telling her, he'd come back to Matewan for the first time in 12 years, and that his goal was to make the lawless bastards pay who had killed his fictional friend, the fictional nephew of Tom Felts. And Irma asked him, well, does that mean bring them to justice? And he said, before today, that was my goal, but after what I just witnessed, pay means pay. And again, I'm going to read a brief excerpt starting with Irma. These lawless bastards, as you call them, have you stopped to think what's driven them to the point they would engage in a gun battle in the middle of town in broad daylight? Durwood pushed away from the table. All I'm saying is that no matter how thin the pancake is, there's always two sides. Before you debase yourself, or worse, get yourself killed, you might want to figure out what's really going on. And attribution for that saying goes to John O'Brien. John was a lawyer at the first firm I worked for at a law school. Excellent trial lawyer, and went on to become one of the premier mediators in Virginia. And I used his services many times in mediations. And every time it went like this. He'd come into my room where I'm seated with my client, and he would patiently listen to me tell him how great my case was, and how if we were going to be able to settle the case, that the lawyer and the client in the other room were going to have to make significant concessions. And he would let me finish, and then without exception, he would say, Jeff, no matter how thin a pancake may be, don't forget it has two sides. And his point to me was clear. If I'm going to do a service to my client, I need to take my blinders off and step back and try to appreciate why the other side thinks they have a good case, what their strengths are. And by doing that, I would be doing a better job for my client. After Mingo was published, I got an email from John, and John said, or the email said, quote, I trust the flapjack quote was properly footnoted. I only used it in every mediation. And he did, and ever since, I have been footnoting him as I'm doing here today. And then a few weeks after that, he sends me another email with a couple of pictures. And the first picture is him from the front. He's wearing a blue t-shirt. It's got a stack of pancakes on it. And this was a t-shirt his mediation company, McCammon Mediation, gave him upon his retirement. And then the second picture was of the back. Every flapjack has two sides. And this is what I tried to do in Mingo, as Sudhakar Jamkandi, who's a professor at Bluefield State University, wrote in a review he did for the Broadside, which is the online journal for the West Virginia Humanities Council. It would have been too easy just to focus on the plight of the miners who struggled to make a place and a living in a time that favored the owners. I think most people who take the time to study the Mine Wars history, will be like me, and you can't help but come down and feel moved by their plight. And yet I wasn't trying to draw any degree of moral equivalency between the sides in this. I wasn't trying to draw it between the coal miners and the owners and the Baldwin Felts agents that they employed. But what I was trying to do was use the power of historical fiction to explore how someone like Durwood could end up on the opposite side of a mine war from his brother Bascom, a brother he loved and admired. And after all, they were both good men with good intentions. And so, how does it happen? How do they end up on the other sides? And what does it say, if anything, about us today? Because after all, these same issues of race and class and labor relations, plus so many more, abortion, gun rights, environmental issues, continue to roil us. And so in Jamie's review, or I know him now as Jamie, the Bluefield State professor, in his review for the online journal of the West Virginia Humanities Council, the last paragraph reads, "Intentionally or not, Mingo emphasizes that we are," sorry, it's cut off on my page. "Intentionally or not, Mingo emphasizes that we are too quick to draw battle lines, too intent on segregating each other into categories of poor and rich, socialist and capitalist, worker and boss, hillbilly and elite. By the time the bullets have begun to fly, all of us have lost." I heard an interview of a gentleman who grew up in Matewan, a black man who grew up in Matewan named Steve Fullen, and he served on the town council for a number of years. And his grandparents, John and Mary Brown, were very important townspeople in Matewan during this period of time. They were a black couple, the first black couple to own a dry cleaning business in West Virginia. And he said that his grandfather told him when he was a boy, never let a single aspect of your character define who you are, not your race, not your gender, not your education. And yet, that increasingly seems to be what we are falling prey to. Instead of looking for things that we share in common with one another, we're too quick to self-identify with others who share a single characteristic or view to the exclusion of others. And this, in turn, I fear, leads to ignoring the other side of the pancake, or worse, refusing to acknowledge that it even exists. I don't know if things are getting worse, but there are some both reasons to be concerned and some hope, including this organization. Another, a topic, an article I read on this topic by Nicholas Goldberg was Sotomayor, Thomas, and Supreme Court friendships. And he says the Supreme Court's most liberal justice says the court's most conservative justice is kind and thoughtful and a friend. Progressive Twitter is highly unimpressed. The article went on to discuss a great friendship between Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Justice Antonin Scalia, who, as we all know, occupied opposite spots on the court's ideological poles, and yet they enjoyed a love of opera, shared a love of opera, food, travel, and even spent many New Year's Eves together with their spouses. The article then goes on and discusses Sotomayor's friendship with Justice Thomas, and she described to a group of lawyers how kind he is. And she said, "That's why I can be friends with him and still continue our daily battle over our difference of opinion in cases." And the remarks on Twitter were unsurprisingly critical. Bunk read one, so tone deaf another. Third said she was either drunk or smoking marijuana. And then finally, oh, expletive deleted, gag me. And Goldberg continued that for many Americans on the left and the right, this is a time for battle stations, not dates at the opera. Friendships across the aisle and even basic civility towards one's adversaries are often viewed as a kind of betrayal or at least hypocrisy. Efforts on the part of politicians to find common ground are seen by many as consorting with the enemy. Democracy requires cooperation and compromise with one's political opponents. That's almost its definition. It requires a basic, even if grudging, respect for adversaries, and if you can't muster that, then it requires at least an adherence to agreed upon norms. And he goes on to say something else that really resonated with me. To make democracy function again, it means where possible to recognize the humanity of those we disagree with. In another article from last year, this was one from Barry Weiss, when she was writing at the time for Common Sense, titled "The Post-Roe Era Begins," she wrote the following. "We know that some common sense readers feel extremely gratified by Dobbs." And that was, of course, the decision overturning Roe v. Wade. "We know that others are scared and worried about what other rights might be under threat. One of the things we most value about this common sense community is that we have different views about highly divisive subjects. What we share is a commitment to civility, respect, and honest conversation, even, especially, in deeply emotional moments like this one. There are those who claim that the time for nonviolence has passed, that desperate times call for desperate measures, that we are in a war, and in a war, the normal rules of politics must be suspended. We could not disagree more strongly with this view. We know that it's chic these days to write off virtues like civility and decency and humility and grace. We believe those things are the only way forward, that the only alternative to violence is persuasion and argument. And all of this makes me nostalgic for relationships like Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, or Teddy Kennedy and Orrin Hatch, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia, or moments like the one during the 2008 presidential campaign when John McCain rebuked a supporter who claimed his opponent, Barack Obama, was an Arab. McCain took the microphone and said, "No, ma'am, he's a decent family man and citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with on fundamental issues." And that's what this campaign's all about. I have to remind myself daily of the pancake rule. And as my daughters would tell you if they were here, I quite frequently fall short of the mark. But the alternative, as these writers have said, is not an option if we want to move forward, nor is it an option to shout down or shut out of the public square those with whom we disagree. And yet, this is increasingly the posture adopted by many of our fellow citizens today, particularly, I'm afraid, among our youth. So, how did we get here? One culprit, it seems to me, is the increasing polarization of America's congressional seats and the dwindling number of what's known as swing seats. Swing seat is defined as one in which the winning side won the previous election by 5% or less. And this comes from an NPR story by Susan Davis. She tells us that in 2002, there were 124 swing seats. 2012, 10 years later, that number had reduced to 99. And in 2022, this most recent congressional election, there were only 30 swing seats out of 435. So what this tells us is we're not only choosing social media that reinforces our biases, but we live in increasingly homogenous districts where thoughtful debate on issues isn't occurring and dissent isn't tolerated. The result being that the only meaningful elections are increasingly occurring in the primaries. Another way I think we got here is because of social media. And despite all of the potential for good that social media holds, I believe we're all negatively affected by two aspects of it that are counterproductive to a healthy democracy. First, because of the anonymity of the medium, we often say things on social media that we'd never say in person, because it eliminates that face-to-face filter that promotes social civility and social discourse. And then the second negative aspect is the echo chamber by which we can choose to only listen to those with whom we agree, and that's compounded by the algorithms that the social media companies use to just force feed us more of what we are already listening to. And I've often wondered if good friends Orrin Hatch and Teddy Kennedy could have had such warm relations in today's social media-driven world. Back in the 70s and 80s, after a hard day of advocating for starkly different positions on the Senate floor, they could retire to a Capitol Hill restaurant or bar and renew their friendship and their relationship. And in turn, that would hopefully help them the next day work together to try to pass legislation that benefits everybody. Back then, there might have been a Capitol Hill reporter who would have seen them and reported on it in some obscure Capitol Hill publication. But today, if they were spotted socializing, numerous photos taken by people like you and me on our smartphones would be snapped, would be appended to social media posts, and then seen in real time throughout their states, which in turn would lead to people accusing them of consorting with the enemy, and the likely outcome would be one or both of them would be primaried in the next election. So let's think about all this for a moment and reflect on Mingo. Durwood, who left Matewan at 8 years old to grow up in influence on Richmond's Monument Avenue, and who'd been led to believe the Unionists were socialists or worse, even communists, a view burnished by his time fighting the Bolsheviks in Russia as a part of the American Expeditionary Forces, finally came to realize the truth was far more nuanced as he began to take Irma's advice to consider the other side of the pancake, which in turn led to a reconciliation with his beloved brother. Let me conclude by saying that there are two things I hope readers of Mingo take away. First is this idea that every pancake has two sides and its implications for us in our everyday lives. there's hope there in programs like the One Small Step program, which brings people of different backgrounds and viewpoints together. And it's based on the contact theory, which holds that interpersonal contact can help in reducing prejudices and fostering relationships and cooperation. As founder Dave Isay put it, he began one small step to, quote, fan the flames of decency. And he says that their mission is to convince the country it's our patriotic duty to see the humanity in people with whom we disagree. From what I've learned about LERA, your organization that's so kind to have me here today, it was founded on these very principles of two sides of the pancake, because you bring together people from all sides of the labor employment issue, labor representatives and employment representatives and academics, just for this very purpose, to have these kinds of discussions so that you're fostering these relationships. I think your slogan is advancing workplace relations, and you've been doing it since your founding, and I think commended to that you continue to do this. And the second takeaway is I hope I've nurtured an interest in my readers to learn more about the history of the mine wars and its relevance to us today. The last couple of slides are just some of the sources that I relied on, and these can be found in the acknowledgement section of the book. The last one on there, you'll see the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum. I told you about the Beckley exhibition mine, but the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum in Matewan, and this is you can access it online as well, do a wonderful job of curating this rich history. If you have an opportunity, if you're ever in the neighborhood of Matewan or just want to look it up on your computer, I would encourage you to do so. That's all I have for you today. I really appreciate it. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
So folks, feel free to chime in with questions. You can post questions in the chat if you would like. You can also just raise a hand and speak up. I think I will start with a question and give folks time to think about other questions they might have. One of the things, Jeff, that interested me in the book was there was a place where the miners that supported the union, they were working with miners, and many of them were out on strike. There were miners that were still working in the mines that also supported the union and that were helping the union while they continued to work. And that I found very interesting because it seems at odds with what we think about in union history and what I have sometimes seen in strikes, where anybody who's going to work and crossing that picket line is known as a scab, and they're going to be screamed at, and there's a lot of hostility toward those who are still going to work, and there's no sense that they also support the union. And so I was curious whether that was something that you found in your research, or just something that you used, I guess is my question.
Yeah, I don't know that I can't, at least now off the top of my head, cite to any source for that. I mean, my experience growing up out there and having been aware, at least, as a youth, of strikes and things like that. I mean, most people that crossed the picket line, for them, it was they were trying to keep food on the table, right? And even if they might sympathize with the union, they still felt like they couldn't afford to lose their job if something happened. If they shut the mine down, for example. I mean, I'm sure there were instances of people continuing to work, across the picket line, but also, kind of acting as a double agent, if I understand your question correctly. But, I can't point to any sources for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I was just curious. There's a question now in the chat from Maggie. And the question is there anything you look back on now and wish you had changed about either your writing process of Mingo or the content of the novel?
Well, one thing, and this came up in a question when I was talking to the West Virginia Humanities Council back in July of 22, and it goes back to what I said at the very beginning about you can't put everything in the book that you want to. The character who really was the real life character who really led the miners in the Battle of Blair Mountain was a fellow named Bill Blizzard. And Bascom was sort of, I used Bascom as a substitute for him, if you will. And I had somebody ask me about that, and I said, "Well, I apologize to Bill Blizzard's family and friends for not, actually recognizing him and giving him more agency. He's mentioned in the book, but I didn't really give him the role that he really fulfilled in the book. So that, I guess, that would be one thing. The writing of it, just I wish I'd written faster. It took me over 3.5 years."
Great, thanks. And so there's another question in the chat. The photos showing examples of script tokens seem to have some in the mix which resembled coal mine tags. Are these different things?
Well, I don't know if if I'm able to get back to, let me try to scroll through there. There were some things that looked a little odd, like you say. I see a couple of things. You're right. I'm relying on the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum when they included these in the script exhibition display, that they're all script. But I do see a couple of things, like you say. There's one I can't make it out, but it looks like it's R something blue with R something in the middle that does resemble kind of a scatter tag. So I don't know the answer to that. I'm just assuming that these were all versions of script, but it's possible something of a scatter tag might have found it migrated into that display.
All right, and another question from Scott Marshall. I wonder if you have ever read anything about the Red Mountain coal mine outside of Birmingham. Very interesting story of the fight for equality by miners.
Well, just what I read in the papers, I think that strike just ended within the last year, and it was maybe even the longest coal mine strike ever. I can't remember now. I don't know enough as much about it as I probably should, but I was familiar with it. I knew it was going on, and I read some accounts in the newspaper, but I haven't done any more research, beyond that. I mean, we tend to think that, the day of coal mine strikes, ended back in the 1960s, 80s at the latest. But obviously, in places like Alabama, it's still going on.
There was a strike in Virginia, I think Pittston, in 1989.
Correct.
It's one of the last big strikes that I can remember.
Yeah, I remember that one very well.
Other questions? Don't see anything else in the chat. Does anyone else have?
I see Mike Lewis and one other have raised their hands. I don't know. Do you see that?
Yeah, I don't see the raised hands. So,
okay.
Mike, go ahead.
Mike, I hate to interrupt you. I'm so sorry, but I don't think that we can understand you.
Yeah. There's something wrong with the sound.
You might want to try typing your question in the chat.
And then, do you see Scott Marshall has a hand?
Yes, I see Scott has a hand up.
Scott, you're on mute, I think.
Yeah, I am. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. When I asked the question about Red Mountain coal, I wasn't talking about lately. I was talking about way back.
No.
And I can't remember, but it was in the 1800s, I think. And one of the really interesting things about what happened there was that Red Mountain had coal, but it also had the makings of steel. So it was a combination place that did coal and steel. And to this day, there's a museum there that anybody can go and see. And in the museum, I was just amazed when I walked in and started looking at the exhibits. They have a picture of the first leadership of the coal and steel workers in Red Mountain. and it's half black and half white. It's just, and this is, again, this is way back in the 1800s. And
Alabama.
yeah, and they were very proud of it. And then there's lots of pictures of them on picket lines together and that kind of stuff. So if you're ever in Alabama, it's worth going to see.
Well, and Scott, I've been to the Beckley Exhibition Coal Mine in Beckley, West Virginia, and they have lots of pictures. Now, I don't know that any of them go back to the 1800s, but they're, I mean, certainly the 30s and even the 20s. And it's interesting to me that you see in these pictures, you know, the black miners and the white miners working together, and they're not always necessarily, you know, grouped accordingly. They're kind of mixed in. And I don't know if you were able to see. But if you look at this picture, if you're able to see it clearly enough, I mean, that's a very interracially mixed audience there at hearing Mother Jones. So this Steve Follen, who's the gentleman I told you about that his grandfather said, you know, never let a single aspect of your character define who you are. He had said in this interview I heard that for him growing up, and I'm assuming he's a gentleman in his 60s now, so he would have grown up in the 60s and 70s, that he didn't experience a degree of racism in Matewan that, you know, existed at other places. And he said his grandfather, who moved to Matewan in 1908, said the same thing. Again, that's anecdotal, but you know, I do think that because they were working together down in the mines together and seeking the same things, there was a lot less overt racism in the mining communities than elsewhere.
But it's still incredible to have the leadership be half black.
Well, that's true. Yes, I haven't seen pictures of leadership. No, you're exactly right. That is different.
Mike has now been able to type the question in the chat. It says your novel emphasized the factors that tended to overcome the racial and ethnic biases between different mining communities. For example, in the dark, it doesn't matter what color group you're in, but I think you also said that only 2 UMW locals were integrated. So that community apparently didn't penetrate to union organizing. Can you comment on that?
Well, this is where I'm going to tell you I'm not an historian, so I don't like to tell you much, shed much light on it. You know, I do know that there was a struggle about, you know, accepting the blacks in the unions and to Scott's point, I don't know about union leadership instances of that. But certainly, again, District 17 in Mingo and District 29 in Beckley during this period of time, it was an integrated union or local union. But, you know, again, I don't mean to imply there wasn't racism. It certainly existed. But I do think that the blacks played an important role in, you know, in unionizing the UMW and the coal mines. I don't know if I don't know much more about it than that, Mike. I apologize.
And we're about out of time, but I just want to read this last comment in the chat from Arminda, who says you did a really great job of portraying both sides of the pancake when it came to the lifestyles of the brothers and their perspectives. That had to have been a challenge. I felt like I was in the room of every scene, yelling in my head for the characters in Richmond to please consider the other side that we could see as a reader. I really enjoyed Mingo, and I'm excited for your next book. So, and I will say to folks, yeah, if you haven't read the book, I recommend it. It is available, as I think Jeff said, on Amazon, or you can get it from your local independent bookstore. They can always order a copy of the book, and it's a terrific read, and it does really display both sides, and it's got some great labor history for those of us labor history nerds. It's great to see. So thank you, Jeff, for speaking to us today and enlightening us on this topic. And thanks to all of you who attended, and keep an eye out for our next Virginia LERA programming that'll be coming up in the next month or so.
Great. And thanks to LERA, and thanks to LERA for putting the 2 sides of the pancake rule into practice. And thanks for having me.